Lieutenant David Brennan watched the silver specks emerge from the clouds over the Philippine Sea, their wings glinting like knife edges in the morning sun. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio, dismissive and cocky. "Those Jap planes, they're made of rice paper," he said. "Easy pickings." David wanted to believe him. Intelligence briefings had told them the Japanese fighters were lightweight, flimsy, built for speed, but vulnerable to a single burst of 50 caliber rounds. But something about the way those aircraft moved, graceful and deliberate like hunting hawks, made David's hands tighten on the control stick. Within minutes, 3 of his squadron would be spinning toward the ocean in flames, and David would learn that underestimating an enemy wasn't just foolish, it was fatal. The real terror wasn't the machine. It was the man inside it. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The date was April 9th, 1942, and the war in the Pacific had been raging for 4 months since Pearl Harbor. David Brennan had been flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats for 6 weeks, transferred from training in San Diego to the carrier USS Lexington with barely enough flight hours to qualify. He was 23 years old, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean until he joined the Navy. Now, he flew over it every day, hunting an enemy he had been taught to dismiss as inferior. The intelligence reports painted a clear picture of Japanese aviation. Outdated tactics, poorly constructed aircraft, pilots trained in rigid formations with no room for improvisation. American superiority was a given, drilled into every briefing, every training session, every conversation in the ready room. But David had seen something different in his first engagement 2 weeks earlier. His squadron had intercepted a formation of bombers escorted by fighters near the Solomon Islands. The bombers had been easy targets, lumbering and predictable, but the escorts had moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible. One of them had pulled into a turn so tight that David's Wildcat, trying to follow, had shuddered and stalled. The Japanese fighter had simply rolled away, untouched, disappearing into a cloud bank before David could recover. He had mentioned it to his squadron leader, Commander Jack Hollis, a veteran of the first weeks of the war. Hollis had waved it off. "Lucky maneuver," he said. "Don't overthink it. Those Zeros can't take a hit. One good burst and they come apart." The name Zero had started appearing in pilot debriefings in late 1941, officially designated the Mitsubishi A6M. The aircraft had been encountered over China in 1940, but American analysts had dismissed early reports as exaggerations. When the war began, the Zero's performance shocked Allied forces. It could outturn, outclimb, and outrange almost every fighter the United States had in the Pacific. But it had a weakness. The Zero carried no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single well-placed burst could ignite its fuel and send it down in a fireball. American pilots were taught to exploit this vulnerability, to use their aircraft's superior firepower and durability in slashing attacks, diving in and climbing away without engaging in turning dogfights. But theory and practice were different things, and David was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. The silver specks resolved into shapes as they closed the distance. David counted 6 fighters in a loose formation, weaving gently as they approached. His squadron had 8 Wildcats, a numerical advantage, and Commander Hollis led them in a climbing turn to gain altitude. The Japanese fighters continued their approach, seemingly unconcerned. David's heart hammered in his chest. He checked his guns, his fuel, his oxygen. Everything was ready. Hollis's voice came through the radio, calm and authoritative. "Remember your training. Dive, shoot, climb away. Don't get into a turning fight. Acknowledge." One by one, the pilots responded. David keyed his mic. Brennan acknowledged. The engagement began at 15,000 feet. Hollis rolled his Wildcat into a dive, leading the squadron down toward the Japanese formation. David followed, his engine roaring as gravity pulled him faster. The Zero pilots reacted instantly, their formation fragmenting as they scattered in different directions. David picked a target, a Zero that had broken left, and squeezed his trigger. Tracers arced through the air, falling short as the Zero jinked sideways. David corrected, firing again, but the Japanese pilot had already rolled inverted and pulled into a dive. David tried to follow, pushing his stick forward, but the Zero was faster in the descent, pulling away effortlessly. Around him, the sky erupted into chaos. Wildcats and Zeros swirled in a tangled melee, contrails twisting like white ribbons against the blue. David pulled out of his dive and climbed, trying to regain altitude, but a Zero appeared in front of him, head-on, closing at impossible speed. David fired instinctively, his tracers walking toward the enemy fighter. The Zero didn't flinch. It held its course, its gun sparkling as it returned fire. Rounds punched through David's windscreen, spiderwebbing the glass. He jerked the stick sideways, rolling away, his heart in his throat. The Zero flashed past him, so close he could see the red circle on its fuselage, the streamlined canopy, the pilot's helmeted head turning to track him. Then the radio exploded with frantic voices. "Charlie's hit!" someone screamed. "He's going down!" David twisted in his seat, searching for the smoking Wildcat. He saw it below him, trailing black smoke, spiraling toward the ocean. Another voice, strained and panicked. "I can't shake him! I can't shake him!" David looked up and saw a Wildcat with a Zero glued to its tail, the Japanese fighter matching every turn, every roll, its guns flashing in steady bursts. The Wildcat shuddered under the impacts, pieces of its tail section tearing away. Then its engine exploded in a spray of fire and metal, and the aircraft tumbled out of control. David's stomach clenched. 2 planes down in less than a minute. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Zeros weren't supposed to be this good. He scanned the sky, looking for another target, and found one. A Zero was climbing away from a damaged Wildcat, its nose high, engine straining. David dove toward it, lining up his shot. This time, he had the advantage. He pressed the trigger, and his .650 caliber machine guns roared. Tracers converged on the Zero's fuselage, sparking and tearing. Pieces flew off the aircraft, fabric shredding, metal crumpling. David kept firing, pouring rounds into the enemy fighter. The Zero began to trail smoke, its engine sputtering. David felt a surge of triumph. Got him. But the Zero didn't fall. Instead, its pilot rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled into a split S, diving away at full throttle. David tried to follow, but his Wildcat was too slow, too heavy. The Zero pulled out of its dive at wavetop height and accelerated away, disappearing into the haze on the horizon. David cursed and pulled up, his ammunition nearly exhausted. How was that possible? He had hit it. He was sure of it. He had seen the impacts, seen the damage, but the Zero had simply flown away. Commander Hollis's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Disengage! Disengage! Form up on me!" David looked around and saw the remaining Wildcats struggling to regroup. The Zeros had broken off, climbing back toward their base. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes, but 3 Wildcats were gone, and 2 more were badly damaged. David's hands shook as he throttled back and joined the formation. His windscreen was cracked, his fuel was low, and his mind was reeling. Back on the Lexington, the debriefing was tense. Commander Hollis stood at the front of the ready room, his face grim. "We lost 3 good men today," he said. "Charlie Rodriguez, Mike Patterson, and Jim Kowalski. 2 more aircraft are out of commission." The squadron sat in silence, the weight of the losses pressing down on them. Hollis continued. "The Zeros are better than we thought. They're faster in a climb, they turn tighter, and their pilots know how to use those advantages. We need to adapt. We can't fight them on their terms." David raised his hand. "Sir, I hit one. I know I did. I saw the rounds connect, but it just flew away." Hollis nodded. "They're fragile, but that doesn't mean they go down easy. You need to get good hits, solid hits, to bring them down. And their pilots are trained to absorb damage and keep fighting. Don't assume a smoking plane is out of the fight." Another pilot spoke up, a stocky Texan named Bobby Driscoll. "How are we supposed to beat them if we can't turn with them and they can take hits?" Hollis's expression hardened. "We use our advantages. We're faster in a dive. We're tougher. We have more firepower. We hit them hard and get out." No prolonged engagements, no dogfighting. Boom and zoom, that's the tactic. But David knew it wasn't that simple. The Zeros had something the Wildcats didn't, something that couldn't be measured in speed or firepower. They had pilots who knew their aircraft inside and out, who could push them to the edge of performance and beyond. And one of those pilots, David would soon learn, was about to become a legend. His name was Saburō Sakai, and in April of 1942, he was already one of Japan's top fighter aces. Born in 1916 in Saga Prefecture, Sakai had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 16, working his way up from enlisted sailor to pilot through sheer determination and skill. By the time the war began, he had logged thousands of hours in the Zero, mastering every aspect of its performance. He was a natural pilot, gifted with exceptional eyesight and reflexes. But more than that, he was a tactician. He understood that air combat wasn't just about flying. It was about thinking, anticipating, exploiting weaknesses. Sakai's philosophy was simple. The Zero was a scalpel, not a hammer. It was designed for precision, for surgical strikes, for exploiting the smallest openings. American pilots, he observed, relied on brute force. They had powerful engines, heavy armor, devastating firepower, but they fought predictably, following rigid tactics, unwilling to deviate from doctrine. The Zero's agility gave Sakai the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. He could force American pilots into turning fights, where the Wildcats' weight and slower roll rate became liabilities. He could bait them into climbing contests, where the Zero's superior power-to-weight ratio allowed him to gain altitude faster. And when they tried to dive away, he could follow, using the Zero's lightweight construction to maintain speed in the descent. But Sakai's greatest weapon wasn't his aircraft. It was his discipline. He never took unnecessary risks, never wasted ammunition, never let emotion cloud his judgment. He studied his opponents, learning their patterns, their habits, their mistakes, and he passed that knowledge to his fellow pilots, turning his squadron into a cohesive, lethal unit. David Brennan would encounter Saburō Sakai 3 weeks after his first engagement with the Zeros. The setting was the skies over New Guinea, where American forces were attempting to disrupt Japanese supply lines. David's squadron had been assigned to escort a formation of dive bombers targeting Japanese positions on the coast. It was supposed to be a routine mission, in and out, minimal resistance expected. But intelligence was wrong. The attack began smoothly. The dive bombers rolled in, their sirens screaming as they plummeted toward the target. David and the other Wildcats circled above, watching for enemy fighters. The first wave of bombs hit, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the air. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, high, 12 o'clock. David looked up and felt his blood turn cold. At least 20 Zeros were diving out of the sun, their wings glinting like silver blades. Commander Hollis's voice was sharp. "Escort! Engage! Keep them off the bombers!" David pushed his throttle forward and climbed, trying to gain altitude. But the Zeros were already on them. The sky erupted into a savage brawl. Wildcats and Zeros twisted and turned, guns hammering, aircraft smoking and falling. David fired at a Zero that crossed his nose, missing as it rolled away. Another Zero flashed past him, so close he felt the turbulence shake his aircraft. He pulled into a hard turn, trying to get on its tail, but a third Zero appeared, cutting him off, forcing him to break away. Then he saw it, a single Zero separated from the melee, climbing smoothly toward a damaged bomber that was struggling to stay airborne. David's instincts screamed at him. That Zero was different. It moved with a confidence, a precision, that set it apart from the others. David rolled his Wildcat and dove toward it, pouring on speed. He lined up his shot and fired, tracers reaching out toward the climbing Zero. The Japanese pilot reacted instantly, rolling inverted and pulling into a split S. David tried to follow, but the Zero was already gone, diving toward the ocean. David cursed and pulled out of his dive, scanning for the Zero. He found it, leveling out at low altitude, turning back toward him. David's breath caught. The Zero was coming straight at him, head on, closing at terrifying speed. David fired, his tracers arcing toward the enemy fighter. The Zero fired back, its lighter guns flashing. Rounds hammered into David's Wildcat, punching through the cowling, shattering instruments. David held his course, teeth gritted, finger jammed on the trigger. The Zero held its course too, guns blazing. At the last second, both pilots broke, rolling away in opposite directions. David's hands were shaking, his heart pounding. That was too close. He pulled into a climbing turn, looking for the Zero, and found it already behind him. Somehow, impossibly, the Japanese pilot had reversed his turn and gained position. David jerked his stick sideways, rolling hard, but the Zero followed, matching him, move for move. Rounds walked across David's wing, tearing holes in the metal. David pulled harder, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces, but the Zero stayed with him, relentless, surgical. David's mind raced. He couldn't outturn it. He couldn't outclimb it. His only chance was to dive. He pushed the stick forward, dropping the nose, and dove toward the ocean at full throttle. The Wildcat's engine screamed, the airframe shaking violently. David glanced back and saw the Zero following, gaining. Panic clawed at his throat. He pulled out of the dive at wave-top height, skimming over the water, and turned hard left. The Zero turned with him, but this time David had an idea. He chopped his throttle, bleeding speed, and pulled into the tightest turn the Wildcat could manage. The Zero overshot, flashing past him. David jammed his throttle forward and pulled up, climbing hard. He had a split second of advantage, and he took it, lining up a deflection shot and firing. His rounds hit the Zero's tail, shredding the elevator. The Zero wobbled, its nose dropping, but it didn't fall. The pilot recovered, using his ailerons to regain control, and pulled away, climbing back toward altitude. David watched, stunned. He had hit it. He had damaged it. But the Zero was still flying, still fighting. And the pilot, whoever he was better than anyone David had ever faced. The engagement ended minutes later when the Zeros broke off, low on fuel and ammunition. David's squadron limped back to base. 2 more aircraft lost, several others damaged. David's Wildcat had over 50 bullet holes, its engine running rough, its hydraulics failing. He landed hard, the aircraft bouncing on the runway, and taxied to the flight line. When he climbed out, his legs nearly gave out. He sat on the wing, shaking, staring at the damage. Commander Hollis walked over, his face drawn. "You okay, Brennan?" David nodded, unable to speak. Hollis looked at the Wildcat and whistled. "Someone wanted you dead." David found his voice. It was 1-0, one pilot. He stayed on me no matter what I did. I hit him, I know I did, but he just kept coming. Hollis clapped him on the shoulder. "You're lucky to be alive. Whoever that was, he's one of their aces, and we're going to see more of them before this war is over." David didn't know it then, but the pilot he had faced was Saburō Sakai. And Sakai had noted David's skill, his ability to think under pressure, his refusal to give up. In Sakai's mind, David was marked as a dangerous opponent, one to be respected, one to be eliminated if they met again. Over the following months, the air war in the Pacific intensified. American forces began to push back against Japanese advances, engaging in brutal battles over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Coral Sea. The Zero remained the dominant fighter, feared and respected by Allied pilots. But slowly, tactics evolved. American pilots learned to avoid turning fights, to use their aircraft's strengths, to work in teams. New fighters began to arrive, aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and the F-4U Corsair, with better speed and firepower. The balance of power was shifting, but the Zeros and their aces were far from defeated. David Brennan became one of the Navy's most experienced Wildcat pilots, racking up 4 confirmed kills and 3 probables over 6 months of combat. He survived encounters that killed better pilots, learning to read the enemy, to anticipate their moves, to exploit their mistakes. But he never forgot the Zero that had nearly killed him, the pilot who had flown with such precision and skill. He asked other pilots if they had encountered anyone similar, and the stories were always the same. One pilot, always in the thick of the fighting, always dangerous, always escaping when the odds turned against him. The name Saburō Sakai began to circulate in intelligence reports, linked to dozens of kills, a ghost in the sky that American pilots both feared and admired. In August of 1942, David's squadron was reassigned to Guadalcanal, where American forces had launched their first major offensive in the Pacific. The fighting was brutal, a grinding struggle for control of a single airfield in the jungle. Japanese forces counterattacked relentlessly, sending bombers and fighters from their base at Rabaul. The skies over Guadalcanal became a killing field, with aircraft falling on both sides in staggering numbers. David flew 2, sometimes 3 missions a day, exhaustion becoming a constant companion. His Wildcat was patched and repaired so many times it barely resembled its original configuration. But he kept flying, kept fighting, driven by a need to survive, to prove that American pilots could match the Japanese aces. One morning in late August, David's squadron intercepted a large formation of bombers escorted by Zeros. The engagement was chaotic, a swirling melee over Iron-Bottom Sound. David dove into the formation, targeting a bomber, his guns tearing into its fuselage. The bomber exploded, pieces spinning into the ocean. David pulled up and found himself face to face with Zero. For a split second, he saw the pilot's face through the canopy, and something clicked. It was him, the same pilot from months ago. David didn't know how he knew, but he was certain. The Zero rolled away, and David followed, determined not to let it escape. They climbed together, spiraling upward, each trying to gain an advantage. The Zero pulled tighter, but David stayed with it, his Wildcat shaking from the strain. They reached 10,000 feet, then 12,000, engines roaring. David fired, his rounds falling short. The Zero snapped into a barrel roll, and David followed, his vision tunneling. The Zero leveled out and dove, and David dove after it, both aircraft screaming toward the ocean. They pulled out at the same time, skimming over the water, turning hard. David's wings groaned, his airframe protesting. The Zero turned inside him, pulling lead, and David knew he was beaten. The Japanese pilot had the shot, but the Zero didn't fire. It pulled up and climbed away, disappearing into the clouds. David pulled up, gasping for breath, his hands trembling. Why hadn't the Zero finished him? He didn't understand. Later, he would learn that Saburō Sakai had a code. He didn't kill pilots who couldn't defend themselves, who were out of ammunition or damaged. He respected his enemies, saw them as fellow warriors, not targets. It was a philosophy that set him apart from many of his peers, a discipline that kept him alive when others died. David never saw Saburō Sakai again. In August of 1942, Sakai was severely wounded in a mission over Guadalcanal, losing the sight in his right eye and barely making it back to base. He spent months recovering, and though he returned to combat later in the war, his days as a frontline ace were over. David survived the war, flying until 1945, ending with 9 confirmed kills. He returned to Nebraska, married, started a family, but the memories of those dogfights never faded. Years later, in the 1950s, David read an article about Saburō Sakai. The Japanese ace had survived the war, becoming an advocate for peace and reconciliation. David wrote him a letter, describing their encounters, asking if Sakai remembered him. Months later, a reply arrived. Sakai remembered the Wildcat pilot who had fought with such determination, who had damaged his aircraft over Leh. He wrote that he had admired David's skill, his refusal to give up, his honor as a warrior. The two men corresponded for years, sharing stories, comparing experiences, finding common ground in the shared trauma of combat. David Brennan lived to be 84, passing away in 2005. Saburō Sakai died in 2000 at the age of 84. Both men had been shaped by the war, by the aircraft they flew, by the battles they fought. But more than that, they had been shaped by respect, by the understanding that courage and skill transcended nationality and ideology. The Zero had been a formidable machine, but it was the pilots who flew it, men like Saburō Sakai, who made it legendary. And American pilots like David Brennan, who faced those aces and survived, earned their own place in history. The lessons of those early battles in the Pacific echoed through the decades. The Zero's dominance in the first years of the war came not from superior technology, but from superior training, superior tactics, and superior pilots. When American forces adapted, when they learned to fight on their own terms, the balance shifted. But the respect remained. The Zero and its aces had forced the United States to rethink its assumptions, to innovate, to push its pilots and aircraft to new heights. The air war in the Pacific became a crucible, forging a generation of aviators who understood that victory wasn't guaranteed, that skill and courage mattered more than numbers or technology. David's story, and the story of the Zero aces, is a reminder that war is fought not just by machines, but by people. The Zero was fragile, yes, its thin skin and unarmored fuel tanks making it vulnerable. But in the hands of a master like Saburō Sakai, it became something far greater than the sum of its parts. It became a symbol of excellence, of dedication, of the warrior spirit, and the American pilots who faced it learned the hardest lesson of all. Never underestimate your enemy, no matter what the briefings say, no matter what the intelligence reports claim, because in the end, it's not the machine that determines the outcome. It's the man behind the stick,